Good evening. Thank you for joining Pilgrims of Abilene and author Rich Ford tonight to discuss Rich's latest book, Wake Up and Reclaim Your Humanity, Essays on the Tragedy of Israel-Palestine. I'm Brenda Mijos. I'm a board director for Pilgrims of Abilene and former interim executive director. Pilgrims of Abilene's mission is to work for a just peace in Israel-Palestine through education. We are friends and funders for the Mar Elias Educational Institution in the Arab village of Abilene, Israel. Mar Elias Educational Institution is a secular school founded by Father Elias Shakur in the early 1980s. Currently, there are over 2,000 Muslim, Christian, and Druze children, grades kindergarten to 12th grade. Pilgrims of Abilene also offers support to 7 peace partners throughout the West Bank and Gaza that have a similar mission, and we offer alternative pilgrimages to Israel and Palestine to meet the people working to make a just peace in this region. We have a full house tonight with over 100 people registered. I see some of our big supporters in the crowd, as well as our beloved West Bank colleague, Usama Nikolou, who is one of our peace partners at WIAM in Bethlehem. Welcome to everyone. It's been a really hard week, and I know you probably all share our dismay and sadness with the recent violence occurring in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. I look forward to discussing some of the big issues in this area with my friend Rich Ford. Rich Ford grew up in Trenton, New Jersey. His identical twin brother has been a prominent member of an Orthodox Hasidic sect since the early 1970s. Another brother is a former president of one of the largest Reform synagogues on the East Coast. Other Orthodox members of his family live in Jewish settlements in the West Bank. Ford is a past member of AIPAC. Rich has spent time in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. His first book, Breakthrough, Transforming Fear into Compassion, A New Perspective on the Israel-Palestine Conflict, was published in 2010. Wake Up and Reclaim Your Humanity, Essays on the Tragedy of Israel-Palestine, was published last year. Sharon is the new executive director for Pilgrims of Abilene. Asria is committed to making a more peaceful planet through her many endeavors, including being the co-founder of the Boulder Nabla Sister City Project. She has served as Chief Operating Officer of Resolutionaries, Inc., an organization dedicated to incorporating restorative discipline practices in schools. She has also worked to support the peace-building efforts of world-renowned negotiation expert Dr. William Ury, which included creating a hiking trail in the Middle East to follow in Abraham's footsteps, now called the Abraham Path. Asria is an adjunct faculty member at Regis University in Denver and teaches communications courses such as intercultural communication and conflict management. We will reserve the last 10 minutes for questions. Please put your questions in the question and answer portion. If you have not given to Pilgrims of Abilene yet, please consider doing so for our work for a just peace in Israel-Palestine through education. Go to our website, www.pilgrimsofabilene, that's with 2 L's.org. Thank you for being with us tonight. Now, Rich, I want to just start out with a question. How did you get involved in this, and how did you talk about in your book an awakening to the situation in Israel-Palestine?
Well, thanks, Brenda. Well, let me start with the title of my book. Wake Up and Reclaim Your Humanity is what happened to me. And all my life until 2006, I was confident that Israel was an innocent country that cared about human rights and that bent over backwards to get along with its Arab neighbors and its Palestinian population. And from my point of view, Jews were naturally more ethical and compassionate than non-Jews. Regrettably, however, most of the world was insensitive to the history of Jewish suffering, and they blamed Israel for every dispute it had with Arab nations or the Palestinians. I mean, had someone had described the daily brutalization of Palestinians or the virtual Jewish tradition in which Jewish settlers protected by Israeli soldiers bring their children to Palestinian neighborhoods where they teach them to throw eggs and stones at kids walking home from school, I would have accused them of lying. And I would have dismissed as an outlier the comment from Israel's longest serving chief of staff, the extreme right-wing Raphael Eitan, that, quote, I don't believe in peace because if they had done to us what we did to them, we'd never agree to make peace, end of quote. So when Hamas captured Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit on the Israel-Gaza border in June of 2006, I began telling my friends that the Arab world wouldn't rest until Israel was wiped from the face of the earth. Then, 3 weeks after Shalit's capture, on July 12th of 2006, Hezbollah crossed into northern Israel and killed 3 Israeli soldiers and abducted 2. And the next day, Israel invaded Lebanon and the Second Lebanon War began. And when friends told me that the Israel Defense Forces were guilty of disproportionate force against Lebanese civilians, I rationalized their behavior. And no matter how cruel, and I rejected all criticism, including claims that Israel was in violation of international law. In my reflexive and uninformed defense of Israel, I compromised my humanity. So in the greater reality, this is what I discovered, I was never a, quote, Jew. I was a human being who was indoctrinated, as we all are, into a particular culture and ideology. Even now, I haven't lost my appreciation for the positive qualities of my culture, but now I'm free enough and clear enough to criticize qualities that detract from that culture and keep it from reaching its higher potential. Imagine if every Jew in the world was committed to tikkun olam, or repairing the world. And what if they valued equality for all people and worked to erase any prejudice in favor of their group or any other group? The same, of course, goes for all the cultures and religions. But if that were the case, Israel would become a light unto the nations. Now, I want to emphasize that I believe the purpose of any true religion is to transcend the religion and to recognize our non-separateness or common humanity with all people. So I want to quote from my book, my recent book, quote, if I define myself as a Jew, Christian, or Muslim first, and a human being second, I will presume that the worldview dreamed up by my identity eclipses other worldviews. But if I define myself as a human being first, my relationship with my identity and religion is less likely to be cultic. Then I will think for myself and appreciate the similarities and inquire into the differences between various religions and ideologies. I will have the leeway to discard the less enlightened teachings of one religion or ideology for the more enlightened teachings of another. Not beholden to a limited identity, I will be a human being with the free will to investigate any religion, ideology, or spiritual practice I believe can guide me toward wisdom, insight, and greater self-understanding, end of quote. So prior to awakening, I was a loyalist, like many of my Jewish friends and relatives, and I did not know I was prejudiced. I couldn't feel it. I was numb, oblivious, like Hitler, Trump, or Netanyahu. In my mind, I was simply responding to the facts. Palestinians were inherently rational and hated Jews. That was a fact. But these facts, in quotation marks, were born of the separate self's existential fear and the confusion that always accompanies fear. I could not have known that I was not in touch with my humanity because I was seeing the world through the veil of a Jewish identity. I was seeing the world in my image. I judged Palestinian violence as a pathological expression of hatred, not the tormented cry of an oppressed people, a small minority of whom resort to violence as the only way they know to retain a measure of self-respect in the face of generations of violence inflicted upon them. And to ensure that I did not become conscious, that I stayed unconscious, and did not become conscious that my beliefs were inhumane, my ego mind employed self-deception to convince itself that Israeli Jewish violence was necessary for security. For example, we Jews mourn the deaths of Palestinians. I've heard Israeli spokespeople and generals say that over and over again, and I used to say it. And there was a kernel in me that knew I wasn't telling the truth, because the truth is that the death of one Jew was more a cause of concern than the deaths of 100 Palestinians, because through the narcissistic lens of a separate identity, we Jews see ourselves in the place of other Jews, but not in the place of the other. This is tribalism, and it is not unique to Jews. We deceive ourselves into believing we are fair and humane and only protecting our people from hatred and prejudice, not from the same desire for self-determination we demand for ourselves. We are unaware that our emotional attachment to Israel, which is a part of our Jewish identity, demands that we see Israel and ourselves as fair and humane, even if, in our refusal to investigate the documented history of this subject, we project hatred and prejudice. What I'm describing is a collective internal logic common to the culture I was raised in, and it's the same for any culture. The separate self or ego will always cherish imagery that preserves and validates its presumed, limited, and mortal identity. So when I awoke from the illusion of a separate identity and its tribal ideology of us against them, existential fear and confusion were transformed into compassion and clarity. And I realized I was as much Palestinian as Israeli or American, as much Muslim or Christian as Jew. And then I was able to simultaneously recognize my common humanity with all people, and then reflect back and see that I had not been in touch with that common humanity. Now, whatever the constellation of our identities, all of us are receptive to ideas and behavior that fit within their boundaries. But ideas and behavior that fall outside those boundaries, that originate from the quote other, are less welcome. And they're often interpreted as threats. When that happens, fear arises. We look at the world through this veil of fear, and we unconsciously project enemy images onto the other. In other words, we automatically reduce to objects all that we interpret as the enemy. And then we hide from, disable, or destroy these objects in order to restore apparent security to our lives. So what we are doing is distorting our ability to see clearly by reducing things to a primitive and inaccurate orientation. When we look at the other, we don't see who he or she really is. What we see is a reflection of our beliefs about them, superimposed or projected onto who they really are. This process is the underpinning for all kinds of prejudice and bigotry. And because it is unconscious, it is automatic and reactive and never inspected with intelligence and discrimination. For example, my fear of Jew hatred caused me to project images of Nazis onto Arabs and then justify Israeli violence as a necessary response to a genocidal people. So this brings me to an important principle. Whether I'm a Jew, a Christian, a Muslim, an Israeli, a Palestinian, American, whatever I may be, my presumed identity, which binds itself emotionally to seemingly relevant beliefs and images, is both the root of fear and confusion and the veil through which I perceive the world. Now, I consider that insight to be a universal principle. So I want to say it again slightly differently. The root of suffering is the attachment to a presumed limited, and mortal identity, and to the beliefs and images that emanate from and reinforce that presumption. If we take that principle and start to understand it and look at conflict, look at all the turmoil in the world, and use that principle, it will help clarify what is going on. Now, we don't see the world as it is, but as we want it to be. So this enables us to avoid responsibility for our roles in fomenting suffering. Because I was sitting in New Mexico supporting the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Well, what does that have to do with what Israel's doing and how Hezbollah and the Lebanese people are reacting? Well, I was giving my moral support to Israel. And if millions of people were like me, and there were millions of people like me, that really, has an effect on what Israel feels it can do. If the millions of people like me withdrew our support for the destruction that Israel was causing in Lebanon, well, then Israel would probably not be able to continue waging its destruction. After all, withdrawing our support doesn't just mean we withdraw our moral support. It meant we would withdraw our financial support, and it meant maybe in the case of many of the millions that we would be telling our congressmen, don't do what you're doing. So what I'm talking about is a collective internal logic. And when I say collective, I mean my way of thinking. I found out, I didn't know this at first, but the arguments I would make to defend Israel, none of which were based on a study of what was really going on, all of which seemed logical to me, they were the same arguments that other Jewish people in my position were making, okay? And this collective internal logic that is self-deceptive induces us to place a higher value on being right than on peace or on being honest with ourselves. If I presumed I was fair and humane, if that was part of my self-imagery that I used to bolster my presumed identity, and if Israel was a part of my identity, I had to see Israel as fair and humane. And any threats to the imagery had to be repressed. What that showed me, and what I actually recognized that was obvious once I had awakened, was that I never really saw or cared about the real Israel. What I saw and cared about were my idealistic images of Israel's innocence, of Israel's morality, that I projected onto the real Israel. These images enabled me, this projection enabled me to deny painful observations about Israel and about myself that I would have noticed if only I had looked without the influence of an unexamined and indoctrinated mind. So if we understand this dynamic, then with regard to Israel-Palestine, we will discover that the real conflict is not Israel versus the Palestinian people or Israel versus a hostile world. The real conflict is the inability to integrate the hard-to-believe but unmistakable reality of Israel's treatment of Palestinians with unquestioned loyalty to the Jewish state. One consideration recognizes Israel's dark side, the other denies the dark side exists. 2 days ago, I was watching TV and I heard an Israeli government spokesperson respond to a question about the destruction Israel has been waging upon Palestinians. And he did what most Israeli spokespersons do when questioned about their nation's oppressive behavior. He feigned compassion and said the deaths of civilians were unfortunate, but Israel had to eliminate terrorist threats. That's what I used to do. And I've seen and heard it from Israeli spokesmen and fellow Jews dozens or hundreds of times. But how many people, how many children have to die before Israel manifests its alleged compassion and admits to itself that if it really cared about the lives of Palestinians, it would honor the promises it has made to the international community since its establishment and comply with UN resolutions and international law and make peace. So to Netanyahu and Israel's loyalists, I am now an anti-Semite. But how can I be if my position would be the same if the roles of Palestinians and Israelis were reversed? Moreover, I am not pro-Palestinian, nor am I anti-Israeli. I am pro-humanity and anti-oppression, which is why I criticize Israel. But Netanyahu and Israel's loyalists have to see me. They have to see me as an anti-Semite in order to invalidate my insight and maintain their presumed and mortal identities. It is a life or death matter to them, which is why they will character assassinate anyone who appears to be a threat, to remove the veil of their illusion and potentially expose them to self-understanding. They can't look in the mirror. So how can I redeem myself in the eyes of these loyalists and demonstrate to them that I am not an anti-Semite? Well, I can do what I used to do. Number one, I can deny documented fact. Number two, I can accept Israeli justifications for its daily human rights abuses and disregard for international law. And number three, I can disabuse myself of compassion for Palestinians and go back to denying their humanity. But if I did all that, wouldn't I be characterizing the Jewish people as inhumane? But such a characterization would itself be considered anti-Semitic. So this unveils an absurdity, and it shows how ridiculous this thinking is and how confused people are, because the absurdity is that the proof that you are not an anti-Semite proves that you are an anti-Semite. This is the unexamined mind infected with existential fear and confusion. Now, my book, and I've written, as you know, I've written two books. My latest book and the first book dispel some of the common myths, many of the common myths that make peace impossible. So before I go into these myths and arguments, I want to comment on the latest hostilities between Israel and the Palestinians. I've heard Biden, Anthony Blinken, and the Republicans, all repeat Israel's mantra that it has a right to defend itself. But does Israel, the oppressor, have a right to create such unbearable conditions that the only choices the oppressed are left with are to continue living under those conditions with no hope for a future, or to react with force? Every Palestinian knows that Israel's goal is to keep expelling them from their homes until they get rid of most of them. That is what Israel is doing in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood and other neighborhoods of East Jerusalem right now, and that is what Israel would like to continue to do. Do Jews have a right to invade the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam, which is what they did, that was probably the primary instigator of this latest round of violence? Do Jews have that right to invade the Al-Aqsa Mosque and attack peaceful Palestinian worshipers? Every Palestinian knows that the goal of Israel's religious right, who almost always act with impunity, is to destroy Al-Aqsa and replace it with a third Jewish temple. I mean, are Palestinians expected to remain passive and accept the inferior status Israel has been imposing on them every day for the past 73 years? Under international law, the occupier has a duty to protect the health and safety of the occupied. But rather than honoring that duty, Israel makes life as unbearable as possible for Palestinians, so they will give up and leave. Under international law, it is the occupied who have a legal right to resist their subjugation with violence if necessary. I'm about to review some of the myths and arguments that constitute Israel's Hasbara, or propaganda campaign. But first I want to point out, I know that there's a lot of people on here who are very knowledgeable, and I'm sure there's some who are starting to learn about the subject. So I want to point out that Israel created Hamas in 1987 during the First Intifada, and even armed them and allowed Sheikh Yassin, Hamas's spiritual leader, to pass out anti-Jewish hate literature calling for the overthrow of the Jewish state. They wanted a violent alternative to the nonviolent Fatah. Abusing nonviolent protesters is not an image Israel wants the world to see. So while cultivating Hamas, Israel arrested and deported, and I think they may have assassinated one or two, every leader of nonviolence they could find. And while not a single Israeli soldier was killed in the Intifada's first year, which surprises most people because of the terrible press the Palestinians have gotten over the years, Israel Defense Forces Chief of Staff Yitzhak Rabin ordered his soldiers to break the arms and legs of Palestinian protesters. In the first 9 months of the Intifada, Israeli soldiers killed over 200 Palestinians, wounded thousands, and incarcerated 7,000 with a minimum of judicial procedure. Also, it should be noted that for more than 15 years now, Hamas has been willing to make a peace with the Israelis as long as it is acceptable to the Palestinian people. Now I want to move on and summarize some of the more common myths and arguments, the ones that I consider particularly egregious, and there's a lot of them. The first is that Arab leaders instructed, and some of these myths and arguments, by the way, are ones that I made. But the first I'm going to talk about is that that in 1948, Arab leaders instructed Palestinians to flee their homes. Okay, this was during the war between Israel and its Arab neighbors. And because Arab leaders instructed Palestinians to leave their homes, Israel is not responsible for the Palestinian refugee problem. Well, the truth is that anyone who makes this claim must think that if Arab leaders had not instructed Palestinians to flee, the Jewish military would have allowed them to stay. Well, if that had been the case, Israel's Palestinian population would have exceeded its Jewish population, and the Zionist dream of a Jewish state would never have been born. In 1959, Oxford University-educated historian Walid Khalidi proved the claim that Arab leaders instructed Palestinians to flee. He proved it to be a falsehood. 2 years later, Irish scholar and UN diplomat Erskine Childers independently corroborated Khalidi's findings. By examining the archives of Arab governments and newspapers and the reports of the CIA and the BBC, which monitored and transcribed every Arab radio broadcast of 1948, both men proved that Arab leaders never gave such instructions. To the contrary, they broadcast appeals to Palestinians not to flee their homes. There were even times they threatened to punish anyone who left their village or city. Later in 1948, and this was never made public, at least not for many years, and it's little known, but Israel's intelligence service produced a paper that admitted that Jewish hostilities were the main factor in the population movement. Moving on, I want to talk about briefly purity of arms. This is Israel's claim that its soldiers treat the enemy humanely. Ehud Barak, I once heard Ehud Barak say that Israel's army is the most moral in the world, and he basically said it wasn't as bad as what Saddam Hussein and Milosevic were doing. So what does that mean? That Milosevic and Saddam Hussein should be exonerated because what they did wasn't as bad as what Hitler did? Killing people is bad, whether you kill 6 million or whether you kill 2,200. Israel, however, always says that it is targeting terrorist infrastructure, not civilians. Well, in 1948, Israel's founding father and first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, said, quote, "A small reaction to Arab hostility does not impress anyone. A destroyed house, nothing. Destroy a neighborhood, and you begin to make an impression," end of quote. In the same year, Israel's most prominent general, Yigal Allon, said, quote, "There is a need now for strong and brutal reaction. If we accuse a family, we need to harm them without mercy, women and children included. Otherwise, this is not an effective reaction. During the operation, there is no need to distinguish between guilty and not guilty," end of quote. In the 1960s, Aryeh Itzhaki, director of the Israel Defense Forces Archives, said, quote, "A generation has gone by and it is now possible to face up to the ocean of lies in which we were brought up. In almost every town conquered in the War of Independence, acts were committed that are defined as war crimes, such as blind killings, massacres, and even rapes," end of quote. Itzhaki's definition of a massacre is, quote, "the deliberate killing of between 50 and 250 victims in a single episode, whether these are civilians, including old people, women, and children, often by blowing up houses with the occupants locked inside, Ariel Sharon's signature move, or, by the way, that's not part of the quote, or civilians and Palestinian soldiers who had been taken prisoner and were killed with a bullet to the back of the head before being thrown into a common ditch," end of quote. And finally, in the 2000s, Ze'ev Schiff, perhaps the most revered of Israel's military strategists, said, quote, "The Israeli army has always struck civilian populations, purposely and consciously. The army has never distinguished civilian from military targets, but purposely attacked civilian targets. End of quote. The next argument is that I hear this all the time. I see it in the news all the time whenever someone is defending Israel. It's the 1947 United Nations partition plan. Now, the United Nations, which had no legal right to partition the land, granted 56% of British Mandate Palestine, because the British had the mandate from the end of World War I till they left in 1948. So the UN granted 56% of mandatory Palestine, including 80% of the coastline, to the Jewish people, who at the time made up 30% of the population and owned less than 7% of the land. And it granted 43% of the land to the Palestinians. The remaining 1%, Jerusalem and Bethlehem, was designated a corpus separatum under the authority of the UN. Now, the argument that Israel's loyalists make is that Jewish acceptance of partition and Palestinian rejection proves the Jewish side has always wanted peace and the Palestinian side has never wanted peace. Therefore, the Palestinians are to blame for this endless problem. It's their fault they live under occupation. Well, in their compulsion to be right, this myth imagines that Israel would have been content with 56% of Palestine and a divided Jerusalem. Israel has never been content with the 78% of Palestine it has controlled since 1949. Furthermore, a Jewish state under partition would have had an initial 49% Arab minority that would quickly have become a majority. So it is utterly naive to think that Israel would have accepted such an outcome. And the fact is that both David Ben-Gurion and world Zionist leader and Israel's future first president, Chaim Weizmann, were clear that whatever land Israel could obtain through partition would be a stepping stone to take over all of Eretz Israel. Weizmann said we should accept a piece of land the size of a tablecloth if we have to. Ben-Gurion pledged to his political party that the borders established by partition were not final, and he said before the actual date of partition, which was November 27th, 1947, after we become a strong force as the result of the creation of a state, we shall abolish partition and expand into the whole of Palestine. The next common argument that I hear people say all the time, that I believe for years, is the failed Camp David summit of 2000 under Bill Clinton's presidency. Now, the myth is that the Palestinians rejected Prime Minister Ehud Barak's unprecedented offer of 95 to 97% of the West Bank and all of Gaza. The truth is that the offer, which was never put on paper and didn't even include a map, was probably around 66% of the West Bank. But during the summit, Barak locked himself in his room and would only meet with Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat once, but only on the condition they discuss nothing of substance. Barak's team never provided any reliable information to the Palestinians, but they pushed the Palestinians to make the small village of Abu Dis their capital in place of Jerusalem. I've been to Abu Dis. It's a backwater village. It's tiny. It's tiny. There's no industry there that I could see. There's just the wall and some houses. After the summit ended, Shlomo Ben-Ami, the head of Israel's negotiating team, said that the prime minister's idea of the concessions required of Israel for such a sweeping accord fell far short of even modest Palestinian expectations. And 6 years later, he said on TV, "If I were a Palestinian, I would have rejected Camp David as well." Moving on to the 2005 unilateral Gaza disengagement under Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. I'm talking a little fast, but I want to get through this so we have more time for questions and answers. Anyway, the 2005 Gaza disengagement, which was a unilateral disengagement under Sharon. The myth is that Israel's withdrawal of 8,500 settlers from Gaza proved Israel's sincerity in wanting to make peace. And the truth is that it was a continuation of Sharon's long-standing goal of politicide, the extinguishment of all prospects for peace for an independent Palestinian political entity. Sharon even said, quote, "My plan is difficult for the Palestinians," a fatal blow. There's no Palestinian state in a unilateral move, end of quote. Sharon's chief advisor was Dov Weissglass, and he said, among many things he said, quote, the disengagement is actually formaldehyde. It supplies the amount of formaldehyde that's necessary so that there will not be a political process with the Palestinians, end of quote. Weissglass also said that the disengagement marked the end of negotiations over Jerusalem, borders, and refugees, thereby preventing any chance for a peace treaty. And he said, effectively, this whole package that is called the Palestinian state, with all that it entails, has been removed from our agenda indefinitely. Those 8,500 settlers, most of them were resettled in the West Bank, along with about 4,000 other settlers at that time. All illegal, by the way. The next argument that we often hear is rocket attacks. We hear it now. Hamas is launching rockets at Israel. Well, listen to this. For the period from September 2005 through May 2007, less than 2 years, Human Rights Watch compared the number of Palestinian rockets launched against Israel to the number of Israeli rockets launched against Gaza. What they found was that Palestinian groups fired 2,696 rockets that on impact produce a small explosion with little shrapnel. The IDF, however, during the same period fired 14,617 artillery shells, many of which were extremely deadly, high explosive 155 millimeter shells. And if loaded with TNT, these shells can spread 2,000 fragments in all directions with a lethal radius of 50 to 150 meters and a casualty radius of 100 to 300 meters. And in another study, this one covering the 9 years, ending on December 31st, 2008, the right-wing Intelligence and Terrorism Information Center at the Israel Intelligence Heritage and Commemoration Center found that Palestinian groups fired 8,088 projectiles into Israel. Compare those figures to the 9-month period, not 9 years, but 9-month period, ending in June 2006, during which Israel fired 7,700 projectiles into Gaza. Another, I've got a few more to go, but I think I'll just finish with this particular argument, this particular statement, really. Israel claims it is always only defending itself. Well, recently, probably 3 or 4, well, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, there was a statistical analysis that was done by professors from the University of Tel Aviv, MIT, and Harvard. And their study was titled, Reigniting Violence, How Do Ceasefires End? And what they said was, it is overwhelmingly, what they concluded was that it is overwhelmingly Israel that kills first after a pause in the conflict. 77% of all conflict pauses were interrupted when Israel killed a Palestinian, while only 8% were interrupted by Palestinian attacks. The remaining 13% were interrupted by both sides on the same day. Indeed, of the 25 periods of nonviolence lasting longer than a week, Israel unilaterally interrupted 24 of the 25, or 96%. And it unilaterally interrupted 100% of the 14 periods of nonviolence lasting longer than 9 days. Okay, it's almost 6:45, so I want to close by reading a very short passage from my first book. Quote, as long as we see the world in terms of us against them, we will have no choice but to identify ourselves as victims or aggressors in the constant stress of battle, disconnected from our hearts, living in fear. There can be no present, only the agonizing past, as if calamity and misfortune are realities in every moment. In that traumatized vision, we must be prepared to unleash our own Holocaust upon others so that it can never again be unleashed upon us. End of quote. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you so much. And so I'd like to invite the viewers to go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll run them by Rich to get his feedback. Rich, I have one question for you that came to mind as I was listening to your talk. And I'm curious, from your perspective, do you think that there is something that Israel's leaders do that either enhances Jewish people clinging to their identity, you know, like unwillingness to let go even stronger, or do Israel's leaders just take advantage of what they know, either consciously or unconsciously, to be present, or, you know, to exist in the psyche with the attachment to the identity? How do you see the leaders kind of manipulating or using this?
Azria, my first reaction is they cultivate fear. So when there's fear of the other, especially when the other is living in right next to you, you band together, right? So it's during these periods when the Orthodox Jews and the secular Jews, who normally don't get along very well, where they're kind of united. I mean, when you look at, now I haven't seen statistics for this latest outbreak of violence, but for Operation Cast Lead, which was December 2008 to January 2009, Pillar of Defense, which was November 2012, and Protective Edge, which was July into August 2014. In each of those cases, at least 91% of the Israeli Jewish public supported the assaults, even though it was being reported more so in Israel than in the United States, that dozens and dozens and dozens of children, whole families, whole neighborhoods were being wiped out, okay? And people would go out and sit within range of Gaza so they could see the fireworks of the white phosphorus, which is a war crime, or the bombs landing on Gaza. So that's the first thing. The second is, you know, it's very strange. A lot of the religious Jews are not Zionists, or they reject Zionism, okay? But they claim that according to the Torah, God gave the land to the Jewish people, so there. Whatever you want to say, whatever argument you want to bring up, you know, I don't care. The point is, God gave the land to the Jewish people, so that's the bottom line, okay? And but the Zionist dream was always to take over Greater Israel. That includes more than just the West Bank and Gaza, in addition to Israel proper. That would actually include all of Jordan and parts of Iraq. Now, I'm pretty sure they've given up on Jordan or Iraq, although if there was an opening, and parts of Lebanon, but if there was an opening, who knows? But fear is the great uniting factor, number one. And then, of course, the propaganda. As long as they, well, for example, Netanyahu shut down the archives, the Israeli state archives that were scheduled to have been opened by now, all of them, or at least a high percentage of them. He shut them down for an additional 50 years. Well, those archives are where the Israeli historians like Benny Morris, who's an arch Zionist, Ilan Pappé, Simcha Flappin, Tom Segev, etc., Avi Shleim, that's where they were able to discover what really happened in 1948. Okay, and much of my research is using their citations. In other words, I try to use mostly, as much as I can, Israeli state archives, because it's hard to refute. You know, if David Ben-Gurion admits that Israel stole the land, it's hard to say that Israel didn't steal the land. So anyway, I'm talking. I better give you more time to ask more questions. But fear is the number one factor.
Yeah. I think you're right. So listening to mainstream media in this moment makes it pretty clear how the Israeli viewpoint is prevalent. What would you recommend in order to challenge the mainstream media narrative?
Well, you know, I guess you can write to some of these media organizations, obviously not the evangelical ones that believe in the second coming, which is their form of the final solution. But for example, I watch MSNBC, and Ayman Mohyeddin and Ali Velshi in particular, those two in particular, have been very good on the Israel-Palestine subject. Now, they're very critical of Israel. They really say what they believe. They're not afraid They don't fear that they have to censor their point of view. Today I saw Ayman Moadine interview Michael Oren, who is the former Israeli ambassador to the United Nations. He's I don't like him. He's fairly right-wing. He's not as right-wing as Netanyahu, but you know, they didn't have a Palestinian voice to counter what Michael Oren was saying, because Michael Oren is a historian, so he knows the facts, but he was whitewashing the facts. He was just saying Israel has to defend itself, you know, stuff like that. Hamas wants to totally destroy Israel. By the way, that's not true. Now, Hamas has given that up. There was a clause in their original charter that called for the destruction of Israel, but that was only amongst the most radical segment of Hamas. But let's keep in mind that Israel has always wanted to destroy the Palestinian people. Okay, now, and again, as I mentioned when I was talking, Hamas has been willing to make peace. They really have. And Israel doesn't want to make peace. In fact, Israel likes the fact that Hamas is there. They don't want to wipe out Hamas. Israel wants Hamas. Number one, if they wiped out Hamas, there'd be a vacuum in Gaza, and probably dozens of radical groups that would be more militant than Hamas would arise. But number two, as long as Hamas exists and they don't agree with Fatah, who most Palestinians see as a collaborator with Israel, Netanyahu or whoever the prime minister is can say, well, we can't negotiate with these guys. They're not even united. Who are we going to negotiate with? They can always make that excuse because they've never negotiated in good faith. They have never negotiated in good faith, with the possible exception of Ehud Olmert at the end of his term. But Olmert and everybody else knew that there was no chance that anything could happen, because Olmert was about to go on trial, was about to leave the prime ministership and go on trial for corruption. Nonetheless, I just want to add this, the Palestinians were willing to continue negotiations after Olmert left. But who was the prime minister? Netanyahu, when he wouldn't talk to them.
So given what you know of your own experience and your own sort of kind of transformational moment that helped you to get past your, you know, your attachment to your identity, do you have any suggestions for how we can help other Jewish people? Because many of us have probably encountered or experienced that they're not just, it's not just a matter of ignorance, but it's you know, like an absolute rigidity in not wanting to educate themselves, right? Like that's
fear.
So common that most of us have experienced. What options do you think that we have?
Well, first of all, you know, a lot of people are afraid to look into the subject. They don't want to study the subject for fear of what they might find, because the fear is an irrational fear. It's a fear of death. Okay, remember I said that the root of suffering is the attachment to a presumed, limited, and mortal identity. Okay, so when someone has a belief system that is part of that identity, that is a cherished belief system, okay, when you challenge it, when you are a threat to it, they experience that mostly on an unconscious level as life-threatening. Now, I'll give you an example. You know, I once gave a talk a number of years ago at I can't even remember the name of the group. They were not involved with the Israel-Palestine issue. It was like a senior citizen group that was involved in an organization that Jimmy Carter started, where they shared, like they would go to Japan and stay with Japanese families, and Japanese families would come to the United States and stay with them. And they did things like that. So one of their members was older than me, and she, very nice woman, and she had just come back from Israel, where she took photographs. And she had been on at the time, an interfaith peace builders trip. So she had visited Israel proper as well as the West Bank. She had seen the turnstiles where Palestinians have to go through like cattle, you know, where they have to line up and present their card and go through and be, you know, harassed and humiliated by the soldiers, etc. And she had seen the separation wall and how it surrounded Palestinian villages, and she saw the difference between beautiful roads for Israelis, and right next to them, dirt roads with, that were almost undrivable for Palestinians. So she took photos and she created a very beautiful 7-minute slideshow. She didn't want to do any talking, but she asked the head of the group, "Can I bring in this guy, Rich Four, and let him talk for 20 minutes? And he goes, "Sure, sure." So what she did was she set up her, her video equipment and played with music the slideshow. And then when it was up, I got up to talk. And I said what I usually say. And there was a guy, and it wasn't a Jewish group, it was mixed. And there was this Jewish guy who looked like a fat F. Murray Abraham. And he started screaming at me when I finished. At least he had the decency to wait till I was finished. And he started screaming at me and telling me I was just, that everything I said was all bullshit, and that it was all psychobabble and all this stuff. And I said, "Well, have you ever read anything?" And he wouldn't answer me. So obviously I couldn't reach him, but I was able to reach some of the other people in the crowd. So anyway, my point is that some people are just too rigid. Stick with people who are maybe on the fence, okay? Now, there may come a point where, where Israel's crimes, because of the internet, because of cameras, cell phone cameras, and a lot of things getting out that 10, 15 years ago would never have been made public. There may come a point where people will get shocked enough where they'll start questioning their beliefs. And the amazing thing is, if they question their beliefs, they won't die, right? If they question their beliefs, not only will they not die, and if they start looking into the facts and find out that they've been misled all their lives, what will happen is they'll be relieved, because they'll start to reclaim their humanity and recognize that they had sacrificed or compromised their humanity. That will be the biggest relief of their life. It was a huge relief for me. I had no embarrassment about the fact that when it came to Palestinians, I was not in touch with my humanity. I was so relieved when I realized that I had been projecting enemy images onto them, but now I wasn't. That was the greatest relief of my life, actually.
Yeah, I hear you. It's something that our identity will resist at all costs. But when we do have the occasion to let go, it's freeing rather than
Right.
damaging. Yeah.
Right.
Well, given the sort of the current situation and in 2021, do we see anything new this time? Do you see anything new?
Well, more of the public seems to be aware of what's going on. Probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, if I mentioned Gaza to people, most people didn't even know what the hell Gaza was. They never heard of it. And when I came back from Israel in 2010, I wrote an article in the Albuquerque Journal, because I was in Israel in 2010 when the Mavi Marmara, the humanitarian ship that was trying to go from, I believe it was Greece to Gaza, was commandeered by the Israeli Navy, and they killed, I think, 9 people, one of whom was an American citizen. Anyway, I was in Israel at that time. And so when I came back soon after that incident, I wrote an op-ed that the Albuquerque Journal published. And some of the responses some of the letters to the editor, all of the letters to the editor called me an ignorant bigot. But one of them said, "Mr. Forrest says he's been to the West Bank and seen the Jewish settlements and the way Palestinians live." Well, I too have been to the West Bank. And in fact, I've been to Jewish settlements, and they are surrounded with barbed wire, and there are soldiers outside standing guard. So who is occupying whom? That's what she said. She was trying to make it sound like the Palestinians were occupying the Israelis. Well, if you steal someone's land and you put a settlement right on their land, and when you steal that land, you keep stealing more and more of it, and you kill people, of course you're going to have to put barbed wire around your settlement, because some of those people are going to want to come back in and reclaim their homes. But anyway, that's how ignorant the American public can be. But I do think it's waking up. As I mentioned, I think before we started this to you guys separately, Geraldo Rivera today on Fox News was denouncing Israel's behavior and saying that Gaza is an open air prison. So that's a big change when you hear someone on Fox News talking like that. And they didn't shut him up. course, he's one of the reporters on Fox News, but the other reporters who are very pro-Israel let him speak. So, we'll see. The problem is that it's a really long-term thing. Israel continues to consolidate its control, every day, and it can't be, you can't report every second of every day, but Israel's constantly, putting its tentacles deeper and deeper into the West Bank. And so who knows how much longer there is before, who knows what happens. I mean, as I've said, Israel would really like to get rid of the Palestinians. So they're going to push them and push them and push them into smaller and smaller enclaves. And then maybe they'll let them have like a Bantustan, or two, and then Israel will have the rest of the country. But they'll always make sure they have at least 70% Jews in their country.
Yeah, so what do you think is likely to be more effective, changing Israel's policy and behavior from within or from external forces? Do you have any thoughts on that?
It would be nice if it could start within, but I think they're too far gone. Reuven Rivlin, the president of Israel, who's a Likudnik, a member of the Likud party, even he said that we have to admit the Israel society is sick. And I agree with him. I think Israel is too far gone. There's not much of a peace movement in Israel anymore. The Labor Party, not that they were they were never peaceniks, but at least they, Rabin at least had some sense of recognition of the suffering of the Palestinians when he was prime minister. The Labor Party almost doesn't exist anymore. So it has to come from without. Now, I used to say that it has to come especially from America's Jewish population. And the younger Jews, those under the age of 35 in the United States, a majority do not support Israel. They support the Palestinians, okay? However, this was not reported very much, but I caught it about maybe a year ago. Netanyahu is now putting his attention on evangelical Christians. He doesn't care so much anymore about the American Jewish community. He's almost not given up on them, but he doesn't want to give them that much attention. Now, the evangelical Christians, not that they're monolithic, but a sizable majority of them, and there's probably 50 to 70 million of them, a sizable majority believe that Israel has to expel the Palestinians, make sure the country's all Jewish, and then that can set the stage for the second coming of Jesus, okay? So obviously, they are very, very pro-Israel because they're very, very pro the second coming, which is anti-Jew. It's anti-Semitic because the second coming would require Jews to convert to Christianity or go to hell. And, if the Jews consider any thought of as many Jews do, consider the idea of a single state solution with Palestinians and Israelis all having equal rights, if they consider that the equivalent of the destruction of the Jewish state, what do they think the second coming is? There'd be no Jews left, right? So, that's what's happening. So I don't see the evangelicals. Actually, a higher percentage of evangelical Christians believe that the Jews are the chosen people than Jews do. It's in my book. I cite that. I think it's a Pew Research poll. I cite that in my book. So
yeah,
Rich, so people are asking what's a good Western news source that you would recommend that's more honest about
you mean,
what's going on?
Well, Al Jazeera, if you get it on TV, Al Jazeera is a very good television station. I've been very impressed with them. But, you can go to Electronic Intifada online. You can go to Mondo Weiss online. If you are willing to pay a little bit of money, you can subscribe to Haaretz. Actually, Haaretz would be my #1 choice. It's the Israeli newspaper. Gideon Levy and Amira Haas are the two greatest journalists in the world, in my opinion, and they both write for Haaretz. Haaretz reports far more about what Israel is doing to the Palestinians than any American press that I'm aware of. And there's many others, but those are some of the major ones. There's Middle East Monitor. There's Oh God, I can't remember. You know, you can look at some of the B'Tselem, B''T''SELEM, the Israeli Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, the main Israeli human rights organization. They have reports on every subject practically you can think of with regard to the occupation and Israel's land grab. And they recently came out and said that what Israel is doing is apartheid. Well, it's always been apartheid, but finally someone is now stating it publicly. So those are just some of the many, many, many sources. Keep in mind that the Israel-Palestine issue is probably the most documented issue in the history of the world. They've been documenting it since World War I and maybe even before. But the Peel Commission was, I believe, in the 1930s, and there's plenty, and then the Shaw Commission was before that, and this is all available. You can, I mean, you could, there's probably tens of millions of pages of material on Israel-Palestine. And by the way, my first book covers, I need to mention this in case someone is seriously interested. My first book covers every argument that you hear. It clarifies every single argument that I have ever heard on the Israel-Palestine subject. That means you could just go to the index if you hear someone talking about rocket attacks, or you hear someone talking about Joseph Whites and the population transfer committees or whatever. You can go into the index and look something up, and then chances are you'll find a clarification of what you're hearing. So some of the myths that I talked about in my little talk, those are all covered in the first book, and many of them are covered in the second book. The second book is half the size of the first book. So the first book is more for really people who really want to get a real big historical grasp. The second book is more for people who want to get a really good sense of what's going on and also find out what the root causes of the problem are. And again, I say the root causes are the attachment to a presumed limited and mortal identity.
Excellent. So Rich, we're gonna wrap things up, but I'd like to give you a chance to just say a final statement. But before you do that, I just wanted to thank everyone for your attendance. Thank you for caring about the situation, and this is obviously, it's an important topic, and not enough people are aware of what's going on. And so I just want you to know that we've been recording Rich's talk, and we'll put it on the pilgrimsofibelline.org website. And if somebody could just throw that website address into the chat, you can get the recording, and please share it with your friends that you think are interested and open-minded. Put it on your social media. If you do that, just do whatever you can to let others know about what's going on, and in particular Rich's unique perspective. And speaking of Rich's unique perspective, this is the book that he's been mostly talking about and quoting from. It's called Wake Up and Reclaim Your Humanity. And maybe Rich, go ahead and put in there. Oh, go ahead.
Well,
yeah.
I would just want to tell everybody, if you want to get in touch with me, because I see there's some questions for me. I don't have a time to answer them all, but send me an email. You can use rich4@gmail. That's the easiest one. I have two email addresses, but feel free to send me an email to rich4@gmail.com. Thank you, Ty. I didn't have time to answer you in writing. The message to the Christian Zionists, we'll have to talk about that. How do I get my message to Christian Zionists? Sorry.
Yeah, and I also just wanted to thank you for your contributions. We have asked for like a suggested donation of $15, and if you haven't already done so, you can do that through the Pilgrims of Ibeline website. And thank you so much for your support of our programs of working for a just peace in Israel and Palestine through education. And so now, Rich, I would love you to just have a final word if there's anything else you'd like to say as we wrap up.
I want to thank everybody for joining us today. This is not really a mainstream issue as much, or it's not, at least not as mainstream as it should be. It's not in the news to anywhere near the extent it should be, because it is the main cog in the United States' Middle Eastern policy, and it has probably the greatest effect in the Arab world's relationship with and attitude, the Arab streets attitude towards the United States. So thank you. It takes real compassion to get interested in such a protracted, seemingly endless struggle like Israel-Palestine. What's in it for us? Well, what's in it for us is that we're compassionate, we connect with other people, and we want to end the suffering. And pretty much everyone I've met in the 15 years I've been involved in this issue, they would be doing the same thing they're doing now if the roles of Palestinians and Israelis were reversed. Okay, so they're not doing this because they dislike Jews or because they tend to really like Palestinians. Well, obviously Palestinians are going to fight for their own people, but you get what I'm saying. So thank you for your compassion and thank you for your interest. And feel free to write to me at rich4@gmail.com and buy my book and tell your friends.
Okay. Thank you so much, Rich. Thank you, Esraya. And thank you, Sarah, who recorded for us today.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
everyone for attending. Bye. Good night.
Bye. Good night.